In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers, all you Sublaters out there. It's me again, Douglas Lain, back in black with my black background behind me, back in Portland on my professional microphone. The Sublation Magazine show is up and running again. We are starting it later now at 12:15 rather than at 9 a.m. Hope that isn't too disturbing or too much of a problem for viewers, but that's what's necessary now. And I'm Douglas Lain. I'm the author of the short story Music Lessons, which appeared in a journal called Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet in the early 2000s. I've written other things as well. With me is Benjamin Studebaker. You want to introduce yourself, Ben?
Yep, it's me, Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, which there's a St. Andrew's Day sale on EdinburghUniversityPress.com running this weekend. It's cheaper than usual, but only if you're watching the live stream. And like,
how much is a discount there?
It's, I think, less than $13 for the ebook, and the hardcover's down to $60. The paperback is still coming for, I think it'll be $24, 24 something in May.
All right, so this episode is tentatively about Jeffrey Epstein, the Epstein files, the Epstein drama. There seems to be a million different angles that we could approach this from, but what I'm most interested in trying to ferret out is how the Epstein story is being turned into an instrument for capitalist politics. How is it being used by both parties in this moment?
It fits into corruption narratives. It's always easier to operate with a corruption narrative than some sort of structural account. A corruption narrative can always be solved with more cops. So a corruption narrative doesn't require any kind of deep looking into the system. You posit that the elite are in some sort of criminal gang thing, corrupt criminal gang outfit thing, and then that becomes the primary explanatory mechanism. And then each of the sides alleges that the other is corrupt and that there's evidence out there that supports this narrative. And then if the evidence gets released and it's underwhelming, or it damages some people, but not everybody, which, even evidence of the most damning kind will only typically damage some people and not everybody. You can always say that there's more stuff out there somewhere that, of course, they didn't release, and keep this thing going and going and going. In American politics, corruption narratives are extremely popular because they allow critiques to be made in a very, very safe way that is very limited in terms of how far it can go and how hard it can bite.
Right. Well, in the case of Epstein, it seems like he knew everybody. So if there was this is a corruption narrative that seems to reach out in a million directions, like
everybody from 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the thing. The names that you tend to hear associated with him are names of older politicians, many of whom are retired or deceased, or they would be retired if this generation were normal in terms of how long people typically stay in office. Mm-hmm. You're not hearing a lot of names of much, much younger people. It's a social scene for people in their 70s at this stage. So, there are some people who have a kind of gerontocracy angle, and they want to clear out the older generation in general, and finding ways to press the older generation into riding off into the sunset is of some interest to those people. But you're not going to get very much substantive change out of going after scandals. That's not to make a comment about whether crimes were or weren't committed, or who was or wasn't treated this or that way. I'm thinking about this at the level of politics.
Right. So, but it is interesting to see that both parties can claim that the other party is a corrupt party, because it seems to be a bipartisan little game that Epstein was running, so it doesn't land on
It
any
benefits from
particular.
the fact that each of the party bases will only believe the news that is tied to their own party's messaging. So if you are a Democrat leaner, you'll believe the stuff that says that the Republicans are tied to it, but you'll doubt or be unconvinced by the stuff that says that the Democrats are tied to it, and vice versa in the other case. Everybody's in a media bubble. So any kind of scandal that comes out will seem to stick to the people you don't like, and there will seem to be all kinds of reasons that you don't have to think of it as sticking to the people that you do like.
Yeah, it seems to me, and maybe this shows some bias, but that the politician who would be most damaged by the Epstein files would be one who is no longer relevant, really, but is still a major figure within the Democratic Party, and that would be Bill Clinton and possibly Hillary Clinton. That they are at the top of the pyramid when it comes to both the association with Epstein and also, who the people, they are the people who are most likely to be damaged and even destroyed by these revelations.
I don't know. I haven't seen this stuff. And there's always a claim that there's stuff that hasn't been released yet, or that people are delaying releasing stuff, and that ultimately the stuff that's released will show this or that. And I don't know on what basis people claim that they know what the stuff that hasn't been released will show. How could anybody know what the stuff that hasn't been released will show? But people make all kinds of claims. And ultimately, whether you think it would damage Bill Clinton or Donald Trump more depends a lot on your preconceived notions regarding Bill Clinton and Donald Trump and their character and the way in which they live, and your willingness to believe different kinds of stories about those two figures.
Well, I mean, there's no question that Donald Trump also is positioned to be the major figure who would be destroyed by these revelations, and possibly equally so. It's just that when the Epstein story first broke, I don't think Trump was quite the political figure he is now. It was before the 2016 election that this first started to come out, right? And the first person I heard about, and if I'm remembering correctly, was Bill Clinton, who had been traveling with Epstein on his plane and going to the island, and whose sexual history makes him particularly vulnerable, given the Lewinsky scandal, which I know is truly ancient history now, but nonetheless, I remember it. And so I do think that the Clintons are uniquely positioned to be damaged for the Democrats. And yeah, Trump, there were allegations against Trump during the 2016 election that he participated in a rape of a 14-year-old girl with Epstein, or at one of these Epstein parties or something like that. And she was even pursuing litigation, but those charges were eventually dropped. So
yeah, both Trump and Bill Clinton have been subjected to enormous numbers of sexual accusations of every kind and variety over the years.
Right. But for Trump, it all started once he got into politics. So it was more recently that he's been facing these sorts of allegations, at least that I'm aware of. So you're right.
Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas at a fairly early point, and by the time he was running for president, that was really the first national attention he got, given his being based out of Arkansas.
Right. So because Bill Clinton's been in politics longer, he's faced
everything has come along at some point while he's been in politics. Right. Anything anybody said about Bill Clinton tends to have been said while he's been politically active.
So someone says, no, Doug, the Epstein files do not uniquely or disproportionately damage to Democrats. Republicans have an even number of pedocons to Democratic pedolibs. Yeah.
I don't know how anybody would prove any claim about this. I don't even know where anyone would begin to try to adjudicate these kinds of claims.
Well, I mean, I know where you could begin. You could just begin by the list of publicly known figures who are associated with Epstein.
But all of these lists are alleged to be fake, right? So any one of these lists that comes out, loads of people say that these lists are fake, and then other people claim that these lists are true. And loads of people have produced, we know, fake versions of these lists, and we know that some of them, probably most of them, have to be fake because they contradict each other.
Yeah, okay, but I know a couple of people who are definitely associated with Epstein, but they're not associated in any criminal way that has been demonstrated, but they have had relationships with them. They were friends with him, or he was a confidant or an advisor. And the people I know who would not deny that level of involvement are all on the liberal side of the spectrum. That would be
like Chomsky,
Woody Allen, Bill Gates. These are the people that spring to mind first for me when I think of people associated with Epstein, and most disturbingly, Chomsky. That I don't fathom. It's difficult for me to understand how that ever could be, but there it is.
It seems like there's some kind of New York social scene that these people all traveled in. And then to try to figure out to what degree were they involved in the sex thing versus just interacting within normal New York social life. This is then the next step. Once you can say, okay, these people socialized with him, then you have to try to establish, well, who just interacted with him at parties or emailed him versus who went to some island or who did, and did everybody who went to the island engage in sexual activity, or were there some people who went to the island and had some other kind of social event there, and then other people who went and did the sexual activity? And if you're doing criminal trials, people will make all of these kinds of arguments. They'll go, well, I met him at parties, but I didn't go to the island, or I went to the island, but we didn't do sexual activity. And trying to unpick all of this is very difficult. It involves trying to interview potentially vulnerable people who can be targeted by powerful people on the basis of the evidence they give or don't give. So it's all very, very difficult to adjudicate. And what's the ultimate upshot of this? At most, you can disgrace some number of people who are very old. That's the most that you can really do, and push out some of these people, most of whom are already on the way out because of their age. So this kind of stuff, to really be able to do anything with it, you have to be able to do it 20 years ago. The kind of window of time in which it would be relevant for serious political effect has already elapsed. And even then, when I say serious political effect, I just mean damage people who are up and comers or who might otherwise have had a significant role to play, to remove a certain number of political actors or agents from play. That's the most it really could have done. And how much do particular political agents and actors matter in this system is the question that it doesn't really get properly asked. Now, the other thing that is, I think, relevant to this is the degree to which certain right-wing channels, right-coded channels that are running with anti-Semitism have tried to lean into the Epstein thing to try to spread anti-Semitic narratives. And there's been a certain amount of that. And I think that's one of the factors in trying to do a document release that quiets it down. And part of why at this point, the game of suggesting that maybe the other party is pedophilic has kind of run its course to the point where now there's some desire to draw a line under it.
Because it's getting the right-wing base and the right-wing influencers kind of up in arms and out of control, and they need to be reined in. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, there seems to be a concern. I've noticed some commentators on the right talking about this, that the anti-Semitism stuff is not really tied to Gaza or tied to Israel, but is tied to something else, or has kind of deeper roots, that there's some part of the right that is principally interested in spreading anti-Semitism and which uses Gaza or Israel just as a tool to do that, where it's the anti-Semitism that is driving the bus rather than the foreign policy position that's driving the bus. And if that becomes the worry, then there will be an effort to try to get the wind out of the sails of that sort of thing. And anti-Semites will typically think in a kind of conspiratorial way. So they'll want to say, it's not just some set of people who are having a sex scandal, Benjamin. It's actually a cabal of people who all have some sort of organized capacity to run the entire world through pedophile rings. And this is something that everybody made fun of, when it was Pizzagate some years ago, But these people would say, see, you made fun of us when we talked about Pizzagate, but now look at where it's gone. And this is the kind of thing that some of those people try to distribute. I think most of them are grifters and not very serious, who are just taking advantage of vulnerable people online. But it is something that the right has noticed that their younger people are engaging with in ways that they're not happy about. The older people on the right are concerned about the youth in their own organizations. And that you saw this in the big Heritage Foundation fight that occurred over the course of the last week, where Nick Fuentes went on Tucker Carlson, and the leader of the Heritage Foundation, I think he's the leader, he said that people shouldn't come after Tucker Carlson for interviewing Nick Fuentes. And then there was a revolt of the big funders and many of the supporters of the Heritage Foundation over this. And then he walked it back and U-turned on it. So the right does seem to be concerned about anti-Semitism. And I think that's one of the factors in many on the right coming around to this idea. And then I also think from the Trump administration's point of view, it become this albatross. And there is a desire increasingly to just find a way to draw a line under it and get this to stop being one of the main issues in the news. Everybody's got an interest at this point in getting it to end.
Well, it is interesting to note that the anti-Semitism on the right and within the Republican Party is a major concern. And it is also worth noting that Tucker Carlson seems to be kind of the most mainstream ringleader of that part of the Republican Party. And I say that without having a real desire to say that. I for a little while thought that Tucker Carlson, while on the right and obviously not a political ally in any way, was useful in some ways, because he would say things that were difficult for the progressive liberals to deal with and that we should pay attention to. And even now, I wouldn't say that everything that Tucker Carlson says isn't useful, but I would just say that there seems to be an overall emphasis on a kind of conspiratorial approach to politics.
It's in part a consequence of him going away from Fox. When he's in a mainstream institution, that institution to some degree incentivizes him to stay within limits. But when he's not on Fox anymore, and he's competing in a much more thoroughgoingly anti-establishment media ecosystem, then he has to carve out a niche in that space, which invites him to toe more in that direction. Probably something he does without even meaning to do it, but then gradually over time, it builds up habits of mind, habits of thinking, and then.
No, I know it is a fascinating case because he has been turning into Alex Jones slowly but surely. And it's not, I mean, by the way, I find Alex Jones to be kind of entertaining. I wouldn't want to bar Alex Jones from the internet or anything like that, but he's not a serious political commentator.
Well, that's important. There's an awareness that Alex Jones is not serious, that most of us have. But when you have somebody like Tucker Carlson, who was a Fox anchor, then there's confusion about the degree to which this is serious and the degree to which it should be treated as a grift. And if he's with Fuentes, does that mean that Fuentes is serious, or does that mean that Carlson is a grifter? It becomes hard to unpick these things.
I find that the term grifter to be not very useful. Grift, what does that even mean? I don't think Alex Jones is a grifter exactly. He's an entertainer.
It means that there isn't really any kind of even attempt at a political horizon for the thing, that the only purpose is entertainment. That's all I mean by grifter here, that the only real function of it is entertainment for a niche faction, and that any kind of illusion of political possibility is just that. It's purely illusory. So a lot of people are grifting without meaning to grift. They think that what they're doing is potentially politically tractable. Indeed, a grift is more effective if the person who's doing the grift thinks that they can do politics out of it, because then they'll treat it in such a way that it's more entertaining. Whereas someone who's too self-aware that they don't really have a viable politics in their media project will not actually be able to play that role. People will catch on that the person is really fundamentally unserious. And this has been a long-running debate about Fuentes. There's a piece by Catherine D. about him, which then Nathan Robinson responded to very critically, which is questioning whether people in that Groyper space, to what degree are they sincere about the things that they claim they believe, and to what degree are they self-consciously grifting? Is it real politics? Is it grifting that doesn't know that it's grifting? Or is it grifting that knows that it's grifting and is therefore purposefully fraudulent and scammy? There are levels and levels to this. And at this point, I think in most online politics, there's a kind of spectrum of something that could really be politics, which I'm not even sure there is anything in that category right now. Stuff that thinks it can be politics that is really just entertainment. So it's an unconscious grift. And then stuff that is entertainment and knows that it's entertainment, and so is self-consciously fraudulent.
Right. Well, way back in the early, mid, like around 2010, around the time of Occupy Wall Street, I was involved with the Marxist left more formally than I am now, although I guess maybe not, but differently than I am now. And I would go to the Left Forum in New York, and I would write for various publications. And I was running Zero Books at the time. So a little after 2011, around 2014 on, especially, I guess. And one of the categories I came up with and wrote about and talked about at the Left Forum was the category of Marxist entertainment. And that I thought that most of what went on in the name of Marxism, even the most supposedly serious Marxists, were really engaging in Marxist entertainment. And the reason why I would say that at the time was because I thought they didn't take on the true difficulty of what the Marxist project was about, which was the necessity of overcoming labor as a mediating force of society, right? They just would move around that and end up in these social democratic positions or progressive positions that often weren't coherent or were self-contradictory. David Harvey was someone I labeled a Marxist entertainer. But I wouldn't have called him a grifter exactly.
No,
right?
A lot of people who are grifting think that the fact that they have market viability, that there's enough people who watch and buy and are patrons of the thing, that this suggests political possibility. So the thing that one might take to be evidence of the griftiness of it, that it's being done for money or being done to create a commercial audience, looks to the person who's engaged in this as if it's evidence of a viable politics because there's popularity to it. So a lot of the time, people who are functionally grifting are not self-consciously grifting. So when I say grifting, I don't mean fraud in the sense of mens rea. I just mean something which is entertainment but purports to be something else.
Right. So, okay. But the question became for me at the time was, how do I avoid being Marxist entertainment? Because even if I was, dry and very focused on esoteric texts and trying to make things as rigorous as possible, without a political horizon, how was it not just kind of a rarefied, maybe fine art version of Marxist entertainment? In a way, we're returned to that position today here at Sublation. We're not; it hasn't been overcome.
No.
So then, for me, the question is: okay, can there be something of value to the grift? In other words, if you just accept that you don't have a political horizon in this moment, can what we call entertainment have a social and maybe far future political value?
Well, one of the ways in which you've wrestled with that is this question of journalism.
Right.
Journalism is something which is potentially distinct from entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
A distinction which has been heavily eroded and perhaps collapsed, but one can make an attempt to redraw it. And then there's a question of whether journalism can be something other than entertainment. So you can run the same sort of argument, but with journalism as the objective rather than politics. or
Right.
with the social as the objective rather than the political.
Yeah,
and that
but
kind
the
of
problem
lowers
with
the bar for what would count as meaningful activity versus politics, which is a very tough bar to make.
Mhm. But the premise of journalism is you have a citizenry which is actively involved in politics, and that when you inform them, can make political changes happen. That is the point of the journalistic endeavor, right? If you're living
Certainly
in
of modern democratic journalism.
Mhm. Right.
Is there journalism outside of that context or framework? Could there be journalism outside of that context or framework? And what would meaningfully differentiate it from simply mass entertainment?
Right. I mean, there are journalistic values which would differentiate true journalism from yellow journalism or sensationalist journalism, clinging to what appears to be the truth, kind of rigor, a fairness, a charitable approach. These are all things that would mark true journalism from as different from the kind of pseudo journalism, which is merely entertainment, appealing to people's lowest instincts in their tribal or partisan biases. But if we hold on to the political horizon as being the marker of distinction, then none of those things will quite do, right? And also, those things that seem rigorous or rational or justified or professional, they all often enough end up being the kinds of values that actually just serve maintaining what is servicing the politics that already exists within the confines of, say, the Washington Consensus or respectable opinion, or within that Overton window, whatever, if you want to use that approach. So, yeah, it is a difficult thing to overcome when we don't have a politics. What isn't a grift?
It is journalism for elites. The New York Times has a circulation of 70,000 now, and a lot of this stuff, if you read it, it feels like it's being written principally for the people that it covers. The sports journalism, a lot of the time, the real serious sports journalism, the stuff that's paywalled on The Athletic, reads like it's really for people who are themselves in the sports industry, as opposed to fans. Fans read garbage made by LLMs, but people who are in the sports industry can read the pieces that are written for The Athletic. There's a total separation now between them. And similarly with political news, there are, some websites like Axios or Politico or something that do these kinds of briefings. But if you read them, the sense you have is not that this has been written for the ordinary citizen, but that this has been written for someone who is in the industry. It's all insider stuff. And that's
a very viable approach to media work, because you have a built-in market that is in a certain way affluent, whether that's they're making institutional purchases or they're simply affluent individuals. You have a part of the demographic that can pay, so that's useful.
And they actually need good information. They're not looking to be entertained. Part of the problem with trying to do journalism for mass audience is that the mass audience, large portions of it, are there to be entertained and don't actually make decisions with the information that are meaningful decisions. So they don't need the information to be good. In fact, there's a competitive advantage to being entertaining, even if the information is bad. But if you're doing inside journalism for elites who are actually trying to act with the information, they still care that the information is good because they're going to do something actually with it. So this forces you to write for a more elite audience if you want to have something to do with reality in what you say. And this is the case, even for those of us who are trying to do more lefty stuff that hypothetically is about trying to reach wider society or the working class or what have you. In practice, if you look at the kind of content that is actually made, it either regresses into being entertainment or it becomes elite content. And it's not really possible, it seems, to hold any kind of middle ground between those two for any great length of time.
Right. Well, I would say that when it comes to the Marxist media, right? Which is very small, but which I've been a part of for a while now. That the so-called elite media within Marxism is really aimed at graduate students, people who are younger, people who are actually in university, and some undergraduates, graduate students, maybe professors, but that's it. Because there's no one who's taking these podcasts or journals or books to the state or to trying to use them to create policy. There's some crossover between those who are doing that and those who are in the Marxist media. There's a kind of a blurring of the lines, especially
there's some
during the
people
Bernie
who can
Sanders.
speak to both, who can speak to the critical side of academia and also speak to the more mainstream side,
Right,
and
right.
publish in more mainstream non-radical journals and book publishers.
Yeah, but you could see the path that Jacobin took, where it started out wanting to be Marxist, wanting to be critical, and ended up becoming a progressive policy journal.
Yeah. And what was funny is that a lot of those magazines, when they came out, their manifestos were all about, we don't want to be Mother Jones. We don't want to be New Republic.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is that it's not about your intention. You are entering into an economic terrain in which the incentives continuously, day after day after day, are become Mother Jones, become New Republic. You are fighting a continuous battle of the soul in a terrain which is constantly inviting you to take up bad habits. It's like saying, I don't want to be a drug addict, but also I want to live in a drug den with a bunch of drug addicts for the next 20 years. But I'll never be a drug addict. I don't intend to be one. Trust me. I'll never try it, no matter how many times they offer it to me. It's a pretty difficult position to seriously maintain.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it might be easier for someone to do what you just described than to end up not being Mother Jones if they start a political magazine and on the left and have any success at all.
At least there are, mostly they're religious people who pull that off.
Right. There's some other value, some other project that they're participating
something
in.
else that they're really committed to. But when you think that you're accomplishing your goal by the publication, and then to keep the publication going, you have to make it more entertaining. Well, then it just seems to be the case that the politics has to be entertaining. And then this is where populism also starts to leak in. Populism offers all sorts of legitimation narratives to people for dumbing stuff down and making stuff contentless. Oh, you have to do this because otherwise you won't have a viable approach.
Right. Well, and again, this is where I feel like maybe not just journalism, but a certain commitment to art might be useful, because if you have some set of values that are not necessarily explicitly political, but which discipline the work, then you will avoid dumbing down or kitschifying what you're doing.
Though you probably saw this with sci-fi too, right? There's a kind of gap between the sci-fi that is serious and the sci-fi that's sort of mass market.
Yes.
And you were someone who tried to operate at kind of the borders of that a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's quite difficult to sustain that over any great length of time. And you would find that some books would be effectively more popular and other books would be effectively elite. And to try to have something that actually crossed it, or even could hold somewhere in the center.
You can read Ready Player One, and you can read Bash Revolution, the book I wrote, and you can see the distinction between what you're between the two approaches. But the authors who I respect and admire the most were the ones that managed to have enough popular success to be recognized and get on the
and
radar.
There were still a lot of those in the 20th century. There were still a lot of the people who would go on Charlie Rose and all of that. There was a chunk of people who were in that kind of still space, and so they sustained this appearance of it as a viable thing. So people who were younger, like you were then, or maybe me later, we look at that and go, hey, there's some possibility of doing something that can cut across or can be recognized in both camps. But that possibility, I think, in the last 10 to 15 years is really gone. And I think the technology and the internet has something to do with it, but also the degree to which that divisions have opened up in the social body have made it much harder, because you not only have to deal with elite versus mass, but different sections of the mass, different sections of the elite. There are all these niches now.
Yeah. And the internet definitely did that. I mean, I remember when Gary Coleman died, which I don't know, I think it was early 2000s, right? And
Yeah, I remember that.
And he was a B-list celebrity, but everyone noticed because he had been a product of the 20th century mass culture.
Yeah.
Someone who was comparable to Gary Coleman today with similar numbers of viewers even would not be noticed.
Yeah, there's a handful of these people from the 2000s. I think the 2000s was the last decade that really produced any sizable number of them.
But on the other hand, you know, I feel as though it has always been the case that, say, avant-garde art was niche art. It developed a small followings of devoted fans or aficionados and connoisseurs of avant-garde art, and relied upon them, along with institutional support, eventually to be viable. You take someone like Philip Glass, right? He came along and was driving cab for years while he was composing, and then had a couple of projects get funded, and through that managed to make a commercially viable career for himself as a musician composer, ending up on television and writing for movies and things like that. But his work didn't tend to change.
You could still do this kind of wilderness thing for a while, but the outcome of the wilderness thing, rather than moving into a space where you now can talk to everybody, becomes now you can get picked up by an elite institution and saved from the gutter. And the cost of this is that now you will never be allowed to speak to anyone else ever again. You know, you can hustle and grind, and like I could do this. I could write some academic books, and then some university could give me a job, and then all of my incentives would be to just write for other academics until the end of time, and quit doing all of these appearances because they're counterproductive or would get negative attention or whatever. You know, like something like that's what is offered to people who aren't satisfied with the mass entertainment. It's slum it in the gutter until, you know, you get picked up by some elite structure.
Right. Yeah. And which, by the way, in a very small way, is my story. Right. I wrote fiction that didn't really have a mass appeal, but did get some critical recognition sometimes. And then I made a podcast, put together a podcast, which had thousands of listeners, but that's all. But through that, I got picked up by John Hub Publishing. And then that was lifted it up out of the gutter into, I mean, I didn't get paid millions of dollars or anything like that, but but it gave it more viability than it would have otherwise. So yeah, but I don't know. It just seems like this has always been the story for the avant-garde, and it's always been, you know, a process of recuperation.
Well, there was a Marxist critique of the bohemian thing, in part because of that tendency for the bohemian thing to skip over any possibility of real interfacing.
Yeah, well, go on. What was the? I know the critique of the outcome, but I only have the vaguest. Even after having read Benjamin's The Author as Producer and trying to explore the 19th century a bit more.
Because there's this idea that it's you know, somebody who really wants to engage in old aristocratic projects of you know, making art and doing kind of leisurely activities. So there's a sort of reactionary character to what the artist wants to do, make crafts and, you know, and have a techne and all of that, right? There's something kind of, you know, petty bourgeoisie about it, but also there's an attempt to kind of resist being bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeoisie don't want to be bourgeoisie, but actually want to just have a right to create whatever they want without concern for what the market will think. And so there's a kind of, and a lot of artists have this impulse. I don't want to be constrained by the market. I want to be able to make whatever it is and have a grant from somebody right? Or just have some sort of rent that comes in from, I don't know, somewhere, and be able to make whatever you want. You know, and of course, everybody always points to those who come from an affluent family because, those people can just make whatever they want. And they don't have to worry. There is a little bit of that in the bohemian culture, which has always made it a little bit of an uneasy bedfellow beside Marxism.
Right. And Tucker Carlson is a case in point in a way, because he doesn't have some grant or come from a wealthy family. I think he does, but that's not.
He has state ties because his family is spies.
Okay.
He has ties to the intelligence services of the United States.
I see.
Documented, not conspiratorial, well documented ties.
No, I'm sure that's true, but his viability now in the market, the reason he can do whatever he wants is because he was on Fox News for a while and managed to bring a sizable audience with him onto the internet for his podcast, TV show, whatever it is. And so now he's unconstrained in a way that leads him to kind of unconsciously maybe become conspiratorial or to fall below the standard he was at Fox News. Another example is from the 20th century, the David Letterman, the talk show host. I did a whole little video about David Letterman and said he was better when he was on network television than he is on Netflix, because on Netflix he can do what he wants. On network television he had to compete, and he was restrained in what he could do by contracts with Carson, and he had to differentiate himself.
Yeah, the unlimit can only be brought into being through the limit. Yeah, and the limit makes it bad and limits it, but also is the only way that you can actually have something. If you give somebody too open a field and there's no parameters and it's just sandbox mode, there's going to be a lack of discipline to whatever it is. And typically, military or commercial competition has historically been the principal means of imposing limit. But one of the things that I think socialists might think about down the line is what other ways might we impose limit apart from military and commercial competition? What other constraints can we have? Because it's the people who are in the kind of entertainment thing, they face constraints, but constraints that come from the market and which lead them to gradually worsening their output. Those people, if they had no constraints at all, would become loosey-goosey in a different kind of way. So the solution is not no constraints at all. There's still a need for rigor, but then how do we impose rigor outside of the framework of the possibility of war or disorder, or the possibility of bankruptcy, insolvency, or poverty? Is there some other way to generate rigor and standards and commitment to quality?
What do you think it is?
Well, I think, for one, you have to have institutions that are positively committed to something, to some standard of excellence, or notion of what's good or what's true, that have some kind of tie to something abstract, which then gives rise to methodologies. And the methodologies are in service of that thing. If you don't have a thing like that, it then unravels very, very quickly. And part of the trouble is that people don't have a very strong commitment at this stage, because of the way in which modernization and capitalism have gone, to abstractions. So it seems like the only way to discipline them is to menace them with war or disorder or poverty or unemployment. And this is the only way to get them to perform.
Right. Well, it seems like your Platonism is drifting. And I also think that this particular conversation,
it's always drifting.
might be a good example of what happens when you don't have the discipline. We have not stuck to the topic very well at all, but I hope it was interesting. Drifting away from Epstein to basically my pet concern, which is how do we improve our own efforts for socialism and communication, which is what it's on my mind whenever I get a chance to have a mind. But
valuable moments.
Yeah. What I'm wondering if we could do is in about because we've been talking for about 45 minutes, which is long enough, I think, for this stream. Would you be willing to come back and just talk to me about your Platonism for a little while, in about 10 minutes, and just try to explain to me?
Yeah, we can talk about Platonism for a little bit.
I've been talking to Chris Catrone about you behind your back. You probably are aware of this. And you've been writing back and forth with him and debating, I think, on other podcasts and things like that. So I'd like to get your side of this. I mean, as a philosophy major, I feel like I should be more open than I have been to your Platonism. I have a very strong bias for Enlightenment philosophers after having spent a lot of time trying to understand Hegel and Marx. But
I'll took a lot of inspo from the old guys.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and you can, and Hegel certainly took some inspiration from the Platonic dialogues. There's, I think it's the Parmenides, which is the most dialectical, and a lot of people say
one could even say that what Hegel's project is an attempt to update Platonism for a different situation.
Right.
One could even say that Hegelianism doesn't realize that that's what it is a lot of the time.
Reading the Logic lately and having a mathematician amongst the participants in the Hegel workshop with the Science of Logic, the Platonism that seems to be in the background of the Science of Logic is something that I've been trying to resist and argue against for a variety of reasons. But for one that I'll try to articulate in our conversation in the other half. But yes, I think there can be an influence without it being merely an attempt to update. It's not I don't think Hegel's approach to logic or to the dialectic or to phenomenology is merely adapting and modernizing or repeating.
Well, a lot of the time Plato. People don't read the Platonic dialogues that are the most like Hegelian dialectics. They don't read the Parmenides, or they don't read the Philebus, or they think that the Parmenides and the Philebus are trying to say something other than what they say. They're not familiar with the Theaetetus and the critique of whether knowledge is even something we can define in the Theaetetus. Mm-hmm. They're not familiar with the Meno and the question of whether virtue can even be taught reliably. A lot of people read the Republic and they think they know what the theory of forms is, or they read the Phaedo and they think they know what it's about. It happens all the time. Many such cases.
Right. No, we'll talk about the Parmenides. It's been a while since I've read it, and it's a very difficult text. I found it to be difficult, but
it wouldn't be the one I would start on. If you haven't touched Plato for a while, the Parmenides is not the one to start with.
I read it
for more advanced.
I read it because I was reading Zizek's Less Than Nothing, and he brings up the Parmenides, and I wanted to check his work and see what he was really writing about. And so I read the Parmenides, and I had already read the Phenomenology when I came to the Parmenides, and I thought, you have to read this as if it's saying exactly what it means to say. You cannot read this and try to read beyond it or read into it. You have to take it at its face. And when it seems to say things that are self-contradictory or that lead you to kind of an absurd endpoint, you have to stay with it, because it's not merely, a lot of people think the Parmenides, I think, is a joke or like a not to be taken seriously, or some sort of exercise in insanity or something like that.
They think the third man argument is just like something you're supposed to accept. Or, and then, people don't even look at the Philebus. The Philebus is great, and it's short, and it's not that hard, and it gets you into some pretty advanced late stage, Platonism. But the Philebus is very, very underread.
Right.
Terribly
All
underread.
right. So listen, if you want to hear us talk about philosophy in a more disciplined way, maybe than we talked in this first half about supposedly about Epstein, come over to the Patreon and sign up there. And we'll see you in about 10 minutes over on Patreon. So, Ben, thanks for coming in this time. And the other thing I want to announce is in the weeks to come, I'm not sure exactly when, I'm going to be doing streams more often and in a more disciplined way, hopefully 2 or 3 times a week, with Susanna Kleeman, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. I'm not sure who will do what, when. We're going to reboot the Writers Workshop, get that going again. And I will be attempting to create video essays on a regular schedule going forward as well. Then, from there may be even more people coming in to produce. So that's down the road. But thank you for waiting through these last couple of months as I dealt with my family stuff, and we are revving back up to get Sublation going at full steam. So I'll leave it there, and thank you everybody for watching.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living